You know what we should have done? We should have like brought a bunch of like plastic like water bottles in here and like casually drank them like throughout.
That's what
the
we should
entire
have done.
video.
Yeah, like Aquafina or like Dasani. We would have all had different.
Or like we could have plastic bottles and you could have like
My
your
reusable-
tumbler. Yeah, and
I'd be
like
like,
you
what
would
do you
be, yeah, you'd be like the good example and
Yeah.
we'd be the bad example. And we just never remark about it throughout the entire video and see if people like go in the comments and complain.
Or like Tanner could grimace every time we took a sip.
Yeah, I would be like, just look over.
Oh, we're making light of, the destruction of millions of
That's right.
of millions of marine animals.
Refer to the penguin.
We're terrible people. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the greatest YouTube channel for debate in the entire metropolitan Starkville area, population 25,000. It's Hail State Debate, and we are here for a brand new topic in February 2024, which is resolve the United States federal government should ban single-use plastics. So with me, as always, are Ace College debaters Devin Hutchins and Tanner Marlowe. How you guys doing?
I'm doing pretty
good.
good.
Fantastic. So we're going to do the usual thing we do on this channel, try to be efficient with it. If it is useful for you, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend, let people know about it. We're going to put the timestamps in the description below, along with all the sources that we cite. And so with that, I think it's time to do what we usually do and maybe do some initial thoughts about the topic. So Tanner, you want to start?
Yeah, I got a couple. I think this is a pretty basic topic. I've seen it so many times. I mean, it comes up in every day.
Yeah.
It comes up in the style of debate we do at Mississippi State IPDA. So congratulations. They've given you a very common topic with which I believe has a lot of evidence for both sides. So great job. But it's a little lopsided in my opinion. I think the con has a little bit of the upper hand because you can basically advocate for anything but a ban, but you can advocate for heavy regulation or things like that. But that's just my opinion. It really depends on the round. Along with that burden, the pro also has to prove that the federal government needs to make this change and not some other entity like a state government, which we'll get to in later.
Or
But
multinational, which
Yeah,
is
or-
one model that we've seen.
Right. So, I mean, there's a lot of other arguments that we can see that the con can make that the pro has to stick with the federal. So that's a burden that you'll have to uplift, but we'll have some of that later. But with that in mind, the con must attack these intricacies. If you don't, then you're really missing out on a good opportunity to win this round because there's a lot of things you can kind of poke and press and be like, well, I don't want to ban, I just want heavy regulation or something like that. So, I mean, the con needs to take over on that, on these intricacies.
So for me, I would say I think it's a nice manageable topic, which is, for me, I think that's something that's appropriate for like a 1 month topic. It's an appropriate PF topic. It's better than a lot of these things where we see, for example, Lincoln Douglas right now is talking about these really broad geostrategic issues in these massive regions of the world. It's really hard to wrap your brain around all of that, to prepare all the different issues and all the different blocks. So I'm actually glad to see the topic committee doing something that's manageable. As Tanner said, it reminds me of like an IPDA debate topic. IPDA is an extemporaneous form of debate. You could, let's be honest, you could get ready to do some kind of a case on this, in an hour or two. And that's good. I think that is entirely appropriate. And if you want to spend more time, of course you can. I think in terms of balance, I actually differ a little bit with Tanner on this. I think it skews a little bit toward the pro, mainly because I think your judges are going to have been conditioned for so long to view single-use plastics, microplastics, ocean pollution, things like that as being a really serious problem. I do agree that things like, other actors and other counter proposals are a good idea. The difficulty you have there is the same one we see in PF debate all the time, which is it a counter plan? Can you run a counter plan? So we might talk a little bit about that later. But I do think the con has some strategic ground with things like medical supplies, water deliveries, things that use single-use plastics that I think most people would agree are unambiguously, at least not bad or necessary. So maybe there is room for saying an across-the-board ban is the wrong idea. Some kind of regulation is a good one there. One downside of the topic, I think, is that the impacts are all going to be pretty predictable. They all seem to link back to similar stuff like pollution in the ocean, climate change, microplastics, things along those lines. I think it's a little bit hard to be super creative with those, although I'm sure, as we see on every topic, somebody's going to link it to nuclear war. So we'll see how throwing away your Starbucks cup leads us to global annihilation, but it inevitably will. So we'll find out about that. But at the end of the day, would it be a good topic to debate for a whole semester? No, I think it would get kind of stale, but I do think it's a good topic for like 1 month. It's very manageable, so I like it. Devin?
Yeah, I mean, to dovetail with what Brett said, I think it speaks to the manageability of the topic, that there's only so much I can say. I mean, they've covered pretty much everything, and I think that's a good thing. I think the topic's really balanced, especially compared to the last 2 topics.
Yeah.
And so that makes things really good. And, like you guys said, pollution is the boogeyman, and so that allows the pro to access a lot of impacts, while the con also has feasibility issues it can talk about. So I see that it's going to be a pretty good debate, especially for the shortest month of the year.
Good deal. Okay, so we'll do what we usually do, which is go in order. So we're going to start with some definitions and framing and background stuff, then pro arguments, then con arguments, and then some final thoughts. Okie doke, folks, let's do some definitions and framing. So thankfully, like we said, this is a topic where the framing is pretty simple, so hopefully we won't have to spend half the video on this. There's no complicated questions about like what constitutes a military presence in the Arctic, or on the LD side, I think we had one, what does the right to housing actually entail? You have a clearly defined actor, the United States federal government, you have a clear action verb in the word ban, and then you have a clear what we would call object of evaluation, the subject of the resolution, which is single-use plastics. But just to be on the safe side, let's very briefly or relatively briefly talk about those last 2 items, ban and single-use plastics, just to be sure we're clear about what's pro-ground and what's con-ground, and then maybe also talk a little bit about why they're such a big deal, just some general information on the harms that they cause. So the term single-use plastics, there's a number of sources of definitions on this. This is one from the European Commission website on the topic of single-use plastics, and it just says exactly what you think. Single-use plastic products, or SUPs, and we've abbreviated single-use plastics with SUPs throughout our script, so if we actually say SUPs, that's obviously what we meant. They are products that are used once or for a short period of time before being thrown away, so pretty intuitive. There's a little bit more of an involved definition from Courtney Lindwall, the Natural Resources Defense Council in 2020. It says that single-use plastics are goods that are made primarily from fossil fuel-based chemicals, petrochemicals, that are meant to be disposed of right after use, often in mere minutes. Single-use plastics are most commonly used for packaging and serviceware such as bottles, wrappers, straws, and bags. So when most people think about single-use plastics, they think of things that are handy and convenient but not really essential. Again, like plastic bags, plastic cups, bottles, straws, disposable plastic cutlery, things like that. Also though, just as a quick aside, remember that plastics come in a variety of different forms. So when you think about plastic, you might initially at first glance think only of like the sort of smooth like plastic you actually see on a drinking straw, or maybe on a cup at certain restaurants like McDonald's, I think uses that kind of plastic. But remember, for example, that styrofoam, like the kind of thing that you see with many coffee cups and takeout food trays, is also made of like polystyrene, and polystyrene is a form of plastic. So don't forget that plastic is more broad than like what you might literally call plastic. There are other examples that also might not be intuitive. Like for example, did you know that milk cartons, which are mainly made of paper, actually have an internal liner made of polyethylene, which is just another form of plastic. So just in case you want to read up really quickly, we've included a link to a site called Plastic Oceans, which sounds unpleasant, but I guess that's what we're trying to avoid here, that explains the 7 different types of plastics used in single-use and other plastics, so that you can sort of know what those are if you just want to be aware of that. Probably not a bad idea to skim through it so that you're not caught unaware. But on that note, we are of course going to talk later on the pro about all the reasons single-use plastics are bad and how they hurt oceans and the environment. But just as a short preview, there's a study from a university in Spain showing that these items are really kind of the major culprits when it comes to ocean pollution. This is from David Vetter in Forbes, summarizing some research from the University of Cadiz. I think that's how you say it in Spain. And what it says is researchers at the University of Cadiz have revealed that 80% of ocean trash consists of plastic, while 3/4 of ocean trash is made from just 10 different items, the top 8 of which are plastic. Incredibly, 4 common items comprise 44% of all trash found in the ocean. The study, published in the journal Nature Sustainability, found that on average across all ocean environments, the top 4 items were plastic bags, making up 14%, bottles comprising 12%, plastic food containers and cutlery accounting for 9%, and wrappers, which also made up 9%. So briefly, these items, cups, bottles, straws, bags, spoons, forks, sporks, and so on, are probably going to be at the front of many judges' minds.
Which is why, particularly as the con, it's important to remind them or educate them that these convenience items that are major sources of pollution are not the only single-use plastics you see.
Right.
As we'll talk about later on the con, there are important medical and scientific uses for single-use plastics, like sterile gloves, pipettes, and syringes. And there are cases which single-use plastics are used in delivering food and water in emergency and disaster situations. So the con side is definitely going to want to present a more well-rounded, holistic picture of what single-use plastics actually do, and to basically argue that an across-the-board ban is not the right fix, but maybe a case-by-case review of which single-use plastics are justified and which are not. And that's actually a really good segue to turn the second major term in the resolution, which is a ban.
Right.
Here again, the term ban is pretty straightforward. Webster, they state it's to prohibit, especially by legal means, to prohibit the use, performance, or distribution of. And Cambridge states it's to forbid someone to do something or forbid an action. But to be fair, these definitions do raise one small question, which is what action or activity are we banning here? It is, for example, the manufacture, the importation, possession, use. What is it exactly? Well, for public forum, it doesn't require or allow a detailed policy plan. So honestly, I don't think you're going to see many big fights on this. But if it does come up, my guess is that the most common answer and the most common sense one would be a prohibition on production or sale of single-use plastics. I don't think you have to advocate for police going around and kicking in doors to see if you've hoarded some plastic forks in your church recreation room. But banning production dries up the supply and eventually results in there being effectively no more single-use plastics. And there are plenty of examples of single-use plastic bans around the world. Most are not as extensive as what we're talking about, which is a nationwide ban of all single-use plastics, at least arguably. But they are still pretty common, and it's worth to know something about how they work and what are the effects of them.
Right. So on the pro, this lets you point to examples and say this is very practical. It's not some pie-eyed proposal. It doesn't lead to any nightmare scenarios. And on the con, this lets you identify the potential problems and limits of a ban. So the example that's probably closest to what the resolution proposes is the EU's ban on certain single-use plastics, referred to as the Single-Use Plastics Directive, or SUPD, in 2021. The European Commission's website gives a very brief description of this, saying, quote, the EU is acting against plastic pollution. From July 3rd, I'm sorry, the dates are screwed up because they're European.
You can't do European date formats.
These goobers. Sorry. From July 3rd of 2021, single-use plastic plates, cutlery straws, balloon sticks, and I don't know what those are.
Balloons? That's an oddly specific thing. I'm sorry, go
No
ahead.
more balloon
These
sticks.
Europeans, man. My goodness. And cotton buds cannot be placed on the markets of the EU member states. In addition, the same measure applies to cups, food, and beverage containers made of expanded polystyrene and all products made of oxo-degradable plastic. So the literature out there is a little confusing, but if I understand it correctly, the EU enacted Single-Use Plastics Directive in July of 2019,
Right.
and it had a deadline of 2021 for countries to actually implement it. I think that's the case. The language of the EU websites is truly impressive and how bureaucratic and obtuse it is, however.
I mean, it really is. You know, like U.S. bureaucratic language is one thing, but when you've got to translate it into like 19 languages, I mean, it really gets kind of out there. But I think Devin is right on this.
Yeah, I don't know how many translations balloon sticks goes into, but you know, it's terrible. So if you want a good summary of the EU SUP directive, again, the information can be long and confusing, so I tried to find the simplest but still accurate summary I could, which was from the Source Green blog in 2021. Source Green is a sustainable packaging company, but the information here is just objective facts about the directive, so I'm not too worried about bias. They say of the directive, quote, the 10 items covered by the EU Single-Use Plastic Directive are responsible for the bulk of marine litter in Europe, more than 80%. These items are cotton bud sticks, cutlery. I'm not going to read all of these, but we're going to show a picture on the screen that goes over it. This does include, I believe, the balloon sticks as well.
It's critical.
Right.
Gotta get rid of those.
But not all the items that are covered by the directive are banned, as Source Green also notes. Quote, restricted items are not outlawed, but producers must limit their use and be responsible for preventing littering. Labeling guidelines must also be followed, and producers will have to contribute financially to pollution cleanup. Companies will also have to launch awareness campaigns and innovate more sustainable product designs in the future. And the most common restricted items are, and I'm not going to list all of those, but we're going to flash those on the screen.
Right.
So in short, the EU directive provides an example for both the pro and the con. The pro for saying that major restrictions on SUPs on a large scale have a viable precedent, and the con saying that EU shows that a flat ban is actually not feasible and that there have to be exceptions.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing the con is going to bring up, which is that even the most ambitious attempt at this in the world by the EU could not bring itself to go all the way and do a flat ban. Still, a large number of single-use plastics, and not just like essential ones like medical items, but a lot of them are subject to restrictions and controls, but not a flat ban. Now, in terms of how well it's been implemented, the EU directive seems to be kind of a mixed bag. As you can see in the summary we're going to flash up on the screen from the Rethink Plastic Alliance. We're not going to read the entire quote, but basically you can see that as of 2022, not every EU country was fully in compliance with the directive, but most either were in compliance or were at least making solid progress in that direction. So here again, right, pro might say it's being successfully implemented, and con might come back and say, no, it's not. There's lots of countries that are dragging their feet. My inclination would be, though, that we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good, and that one of the things that the pro can generally argue is that even if implementation isn't perfect, even if it's not 100%, what this is mainly about is reducing the amount of single-use plastics, and that essentially any gain in that regard is a good one. Now, they might have some trouble like actually crossing like thresholds and saying, okay, well, we'll have measurably less climate change. So that's an important thing. But generally speaking, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Less plastic waste is better than more, even if you can't completely eliminate it. Unlike the EU, though, the United States obviously doesn't have a broad prohibition on single-use plastics, which is why we are debating this topic. But there are more piecemeal limited efforts going on in the U.S. right now, as reflected in this from Seaside Sustainability in March 2023. It says, currently the U.S. has not placed a single-use plastic ban on a federal level, but this responsibility has been taken up by states and cities. Connecticut, California, Delaware, Hawaii, Maine, New York, Oregon, and Vermont all have placed bans on plastic bags. San Francisco was the first city to completely ban plastic bags in 2007. The rest of California implemented their ban in 2014, and since then, there's been a 70% reduction in plastic bag usage in the state. So that might be a good statistic to say, even if there's not perfect adherence, a 70% reduction would be a fantastic first step, or just a fantastic step in general. However, you can find plastic bags in grocery stores as rules have not been enforced properly over the past few years. New York faces a similar situation as plastic bags were banned in the state in 2020, but some businesses still continue to distribute them, again, mostly due to lax enforcement of pollution rules. So here again, right, the pro is going to look at this and say, this is exactly why we need a flat federal ban. It is just too hard to do this piecemeal. It's hard to keep plastic out of a given city or a given state to do it on a piecemeal level when you've got them circulating in the market all over the country. It's just too easy to buy them and too hard to enforce, which I guess is as good a segue as we're going to get to the one final point we need to have in our background section, which is less about definitions and more about sort of just general factual background, and that is...
What's so bad about single-use plastics? Now that's the big question, and if you've done any research on the topic or just followed the news generally over the last 5 years, you can have some idea of the answer to this. First, single-use plastics, when not properly disposed of, too often make their way into rivers and other bodies of water, and eventually oceans, which causes massive harm to marine life and essentially the entire ocean ecosystem. This picture right here, this is a bunch of plastic in the ocean. This is referred to as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And there are terrifying statistics like the assertion by the Natural Resource Defense Council that by 2050, there will be more plastic garbage than fish in the ocean by weight. Just some real environmental dystopia stuff that most judges and most people will react badly to. But to be fair, there is the question of how this how will these impacts to regular people. The idea of garbage in the ocean is unpleasant, but how does it make it to your life in the worst measurable way? Well, there are two big answers to this, and these are two of the major impacts you're going to see in most pro cases. One comes at the beginning of the single-use plastic's lifespan, and that's the environmental harm of manufacturing it. And the other comes at the end, which is the health and environmental damage stemming from the breakdown of plastics into microplastics, which I assume all of y'all have heard about. So looking at the front end of manufacturing, we can look again to the summary from the Natural Resource Defense Council, Courtney Lindwall. She stated a 2019 report by the Center for International Environmental Law showed that plastic production contributes to planet warming greenhouse gas emissions at every point in its life cycle. Refineries where crude oil is turned into plastic make up one of the most greenhouse gas intensive industries in manufacturing sector. And cracker plants. I guess that's what they're called.
I guess so.
Cracker plants.
Never heard of that one
Yeah,
before.
I don't know. Not saltine crackers. These are different.
Different crackers.
Yeah, different type. It says that which break and crack ethane molecules, which contribute to global warming, into the chemical building blocks of plastic products, are energy intensive and highly polluting. A CIEL report in 2015, they said that a mere 24 of these ethane cracker facilities in the U.S. had the combined carbon output of 3.8 million passenger vehicles. And that's really bad news for our carbon reduction goals. If plastic production continues unabated, its greenhouse gas emissions could reach 1.34 gigatons per year by 2030, equal to adding nearly 300 new coal-fired power plants.
Yeah, and so in addition to the climate impact, which is going to be a big deal, there's also the health and sort of the general environmental impacts as these single-use plastics break down in the environment. And essentially the problem is that they don't break down in the same way that like organics do. They don't biodegrade in the way that like your food or paper or products or things like that would biodegrade. Instead, they just sort of break up into microplastics, which are just what they sound like. And as Tanner said, you've probably heard of these before. They're tiny bits of plastic that they can get literally swallowed up, make their way into our food chain, into our water, into our bodies, make their way into animals. We'll talk about why that's important later on from a climate change perspective. And this has a whole lot of harmful impacts that we'll talk about when we get to the pro. And speaking of which, that is, again, a good segue to go into the part of the video that you have all been waiting for, which are the actual substantive arguments on the pro. All right, so on the pro, we actually have a lot to cover. There are, a fair number of substantive arguments here, a lot of data to talk about. So let's jump right in and start with what I think is maybe one of the impacts that most people kind of intuitively think about when they think about single-use plastics, which is just sort of general environmental degradation. This may not be the biggest link in and of itself, but it can play a role in the case in the sense that it's sort of the in-between point, right? It helps to link to other things and it's important to understand it. So let's just start with that because it's stuff that frankly many judges are thinking about as they walk into the round. And what we're talking about here, obviously, is just sort of the general pollution and environmental degradation you see, the floating trash fields, right? The littered coastlines, the overflowing landfills. This stuff paints a really troubling picture, mental image for the judges, which is exactly what the pro wants, is sort of general background in the round. So we kick it off with the United Nations report on plastic production from 2023, and what it says is, on average, the world is producing 430 million tons of plastic per year, 2/3 of which are only used for a short period of time. Wrappers for our chocolate bars, packets for our crisps, which, by the way, is what British people call chips.
And balloon
The
sticks.
correct name is chips, but that's fine. We'll bear with them. Plastic utensils for our lunch, forks, spoons, and sporks. But this brief life cycle has consequences. Every day, the equivalent of over 2,000 garbage trucks full of plastic are dumped into our oceans. And by the way, it is useful to use kind of visceral imagery like that when we talk about it. When we say 430 million tons, most people have no conception of what that means. They can't visualize it. So while I know we're inclined in like public forum debate to be very dependent on statistics, once in a while saying something like 2,000 garbage trucks full of plastic dumped into the ocean might be a good way to sort of link to an impact with many judges, right? As a result, plastic pollution is set to triple by 2060 if no action is taken. This puts the United States at number one, not just in plastic use, but also in the creation of total plastic waste. So this is from Greenmatch blog in 2023, citing research from the UN Environment Program. It says plastic use has increased significantly in the United States over the previous 4 decades, with at least 85% of municipal plastic waste disposed of in landfills. The United States produces over 42 million metric tons of plastic waste each year, which equates to approximately 130 kilograms of rubbish, again, British term there, trash for every American. The recycling rate for plastic waste in the United States is declining, with only 5 to 6% recycled as of 2021 statistics. So, okay, the U.S. uses a lot of plastic stuff, but how much of that plastic stuff is single-use plastics? Well, according to the United Nations Environment Program in 2021, you get a generous estimate of the percentage of all plastics being used for single-use purposes. It says approximately 36% of all plastics produced are used in packaging, including single-use plastic products for food and beverage containers, approximately 85% of which end up in landfills. To provide a generalized statistic, Plastic Oceans International says We're producing 380 million tons of plastic every year. 50% of that is for single-use purposes. So, somewhere between, and these estimates obviously differ from one another, somewhere between 35 or 36% to 50% of all the plastic that we're producing, possibly more, according to some statistics, is for single-use purposes. Making matters worse, the vast majority of these products were not and never will be recycled. So this is according to Christy Keith, Gaia's international coordinator, reporting on waste seen in single-use plastics. And it says, and this is a very common statistic, nearly 95% of single-use plastic never gets recycled. Unfortunately, much of it ends up in landfills while the rest ends up getting burned in incinerators. In fact, 6 times more plastic waste is burned in the United States than is recycled. So basically, when we talk about a single-use plastic, most of the time, 95% of the time, it truly is single-use. Its useful life is literally from the time when you take the cup in your hand in the drive-thru to the time you throw it away in the trash 30 minutes later, and then it becomes waste that's going to affect the environment for years, decades, or even centuries to come.
Right, and beyond the sheer amount of plastic, you have to have the effect it has on the ocean, marine ecosystems, and so on. So a good summary comes from Caroline Gordon at Duke University U.S. Environmental Policy blog in 2019. They state that annually about 8.8 million tons of plastic waste enters and pollutes our oceans. In addition, plastic debris constitutes 60% to 80% of all marine pollution, and in some areas can account for as much as 90 to 95% of all pollution. At least 700 species worldwide have been affected by plastic ocean pollution, including 84% of sea turtle species, 44% of all seabird species, and 43% of all marine mammal species. And there is an economic price tag associated with this environmental harm. Again, according to Gordon, it's the cost of both the environmental damages and social impacts of plastic use in the U.S. is about $75 billion. So without belaboring the point at all, any further, the general impact of single-use plastics based on pollution is massive. It's visceral, it's ugly.
Right.
But as we mentioned, it's also not something that is easy to quantify in terms of how it impacts people's lives, which is why we need to move on and talk about other impacts, like
disrupting the global food chain.
Mm-hmm.
So very briefly, let's go over how SUPs specifically pollute our oceans. There was a little bit that Tanner touched on, but I want to go a little bit further. So first, according to Marta Fava, writing for UNESCO in 2022, she writes about how plastic comprises of a very huge majority of all oceanic pollution. She writes that, quote, plastic waste makes up 80% of all marine pollution. And in 2018, the United Nations Environment Program estimated that an overwhelming majority of plastic pollution in the ocean is from SUPs. And what they did was literally they conducted a study where they grabbed up swaths of garbage and then decided what was actually comprising that garbage. And they found that 89% of that garbage was single-use products. And the deeper they got, we'll show the quote on the screen, they found that basically everything they found was single-use plastic. And in 2016, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimates that the sheer abhorrently massive tonnage of plastic in the ocean is probably in the hundreds of millions. They say, quote, the best research currently available estimates that there are over 150 million tons of plastics in the ocean today. And in kind with the growth of SUP consumption, oceanic pollution is expected to rise as well, and drastically. In that same report, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation continues estimates of current pollution with its estimates of future pollution, saying, quote, in a business-as-usual scenario, the ocean is expected to contain 1 ton of plastic for every 3 tons of fish by 2025. Next year, this is going to happen. Right. And in 2050, more plastics than fish by weight.
And that's, by the way, another good example of a visceral way to illustrate it. 2,000 garbage trucks, more plastic than fish, right? Things that you can say.
Right. I mean, you're basically telling the judge that the ocean is going to contain plastic and a little bit of fish as compared, like it's littered with fish instead of plastic this time around. Basically, the most important takeaway for the pro is not that our oceans may not look as pristine as possible, or that we might see more poignant photos of penguins decorated with plastic litter, but that this plastic waste will massively decrease marine populations. Either in macro or in micro form, single-use plastics pose a direct threat to oceanic biodiversity and, in turn, the global food supply. Firstly, let's focus on the coral reefs. Drew Harvell et al. Published a 4-year-long study in 2018 which details the effects of plastic on our coral reefs, saying, quote, we assessed the influence of plastic waste on disease risk in 124,000 reef-building corals from 159 reefs in the Asia-Pacific region. the likelihood of disease increased from 4% to 89% when corals are in contact with plastic, which is just ridiculous. Every single time, I mean, this is, functionally speaking, the second that a coral touches a piece of plastic, it is infected with the disease. They say further, we estimate that 11.1 billion plastic items are entangled on coral reefs across the Asia Pacific and project this number to increase by 40% by 2025. So next year, that will have jumped by 40% from when this study was created in 2018. For coral reefs, increased plastic waste in the ocean from single-use plastics is literally a death sentence. And if corals aren't killed by exposure to pathogens spread by plastic entanglement, their reproduction or structure is severely hampered.
Right, and the impact here is massive. It's not just that coral reefs have kind of sort of been a symbol of like biodiversity since I was a kid. I remember doing like science projects about them and having them in our science classes when I was a kid. But there's a practical impact here as well. A world without coral reefs it sees massive declines in millions of other marine populations and steep drop-offs in marine biomass. In and of itself, a depleted ocean is terrible, but it's really bad for humanity. So this comes from Alice Rogers and others in a 2017 study published in the British Ecological Society Journal, and it says the erosion of branching corals, which is like dead coral and branching rubble, caused biomass declines followed by a dramatic 64% reduction of biomass when all refuges were lost. So we're losing just huge numbers of species in absolute terms. You could talk about extinctions, but even if we're not talking about absolute extinctions, you're seeing a massive reduction in fish and other ocean life population. So in layman's terms, when an individual coral dies, right, when the coral dies, you actually do see a short-term increase in biomass, but in the long term, when the structure of the coral dies away, there is a mass die-off of marine wildlife. So the World Wildlife Fund writes in 2023 about how many people a collapse in the food supply might impact. And what it says is that more than 3 billion people in the world rely on wild-caught and farmed seafood as a significant source of animal protein. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that 85% of marine fish stocks are either fully exploited or overfished. So nearly half the global population relies on fisheries for their daily sustenance, and 85% of these fisheries are already overexploiting their existing stock. So if we're going to go out there and essentially threaten our coral, right, coral systems, we're putting that biomass, those species, that marine life in danger. And in the long run, that's something that hurts the ability of human beings that rely on those fisheries to basically survive, to subsist, right? Which is a bad catastrophe. But speaking of even worse catastrophes, there is the impact of
fueling climate change, which is going to be pretty big in the debate I will see. But as mentioned above, plastics, or at least a majority of them, are made up of fossil fuels. Uniquely, single-use plastics, because of their transient nature, consume loads of fossil fuels. In any case, where we are trying to clamp down on emissions, this is an obvious problem. So if you want to clamp down on your emissions, you don't want to just produce a ridiculous amount of plastic. We got to shut that down. So a majorly important reason to ban single-use plastics is because of their massive contribution to climate change. So first off, single-use plastics are massive emitters in their production. The University of Colorado Boulder quotes the amount of greenhouse gases emitted due to single-use plastic production in the hundreds of millions. They stated that the refinement of plastic emits an additional 184 to 213 million metric tons of greenhouse gases each year. There is an even more blunt explanation from Iris Crawford and MIT Climate Portal in 2022. They stated that a 2019 report from the Center for International Environmental Law projects that an industry will release up to 1.34 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually by 2036, about equal to the emissions of the entire continent of Africa today.
Okay, and hit pause. Again, another good visceral example, right? The greenhouse gas emissions from this, billions of tons, mean nothing to most judges. By 2036, this production will be equal to the entire continent of Africa.
Right, and it's absolutely absurd, so make that known. And Crawford also adds that the climate impact doesn't end with manufacture, with plastics continuing to emit carbon long after they're thrown away. She notes the resulting plastic waste will continue releasing more emissions the longer it sits around. The most commonly used plastic have been shown to release the greenhouse gases ethylene and methane as they decompose, the latter of which traps atmospheric heat at 25 times the rate of carbon dioxide over the course of a century. So basically, without a ban or some other dramatic step, this massive climate impact equaled the aviation industry or the continent of Africa is only going to expand in scope and get worse. So a ban is necessary. On the exact point, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation lays out the future of plastic production and emissions in 2016 report. They state that plastic packaging volumes are expected to continue their strong growth, doubling within 15 years and more than quadrupling by 2050 to 318 million tons annually, more than the entire plastics industry today. So we can see it's going to continue to grow, and that's not something that in the app world is good, because you can see how it contributes to the climate change issue. So if the current strong growth of plastics usage continues as expects, the plastic sector will account for 20% of total oil consumption and 15% of the global annual carbon budget, the amount of carbon we can safely emit by 2050. So I would suggest reading this report. It has some really good numbers. Make it relatable to the judge, because it's a lot of big numbers, so try to make it digestible for him. But it is by far the most detailed report out there.
So anyway, climate change is a pretty clear, straightforward impact. Now, as a caveat, I will say, to be fair, on the con side, any kind of packaging that you produce is going to have an impact on the climate, because literally everything you manufacture requires energy. So for example, if you go out and Google search for the environmental impact of paper production, which would probably be the chief alternative to single-use plastics, you're actually going to find statistics out there about how that also contributes to major greenhouse gas emissions. And I would think that really well-prepared con teams would probably have some of that and say, like, look, it's not single-use plastics so much as it is just manufacturing any kind of packaging does this. But I will say, I think that overall the stronger argument is that you're going to see more emissions coming out of single-use plastics. But anyway, while the climate impact is a strong impact, if you want something that's truly unique to single-use plastics, you may need to look to another issue, like, for example,
microplastics.
Hey.
This argument probably comes straight to the mind for basically everyone on the pro. I think we've all read the news and seen, the microplastic boogeyman. It's in our blood, it's in our liver, whatever it may be. It's a huge problem. Right? And it's also, this argument in and of itself is intuitive. It has the highest relative impact, unless you're going to spite Brett and run nuclear war.
Which you are.
Right, you're going to do it anyways. But please, do run this too. It's a simple argument. We don't have to read the tea leaves here. Single-use plastics make up a majority of plastic waste in general, and that waste breaks down into what is known as secondary microplastic. Some primary microplastic, already tiny plastic like glitter or cosmetic microbeads, things that were made to be microplastics, things that didn't break up, like Brett mentioned earlier. It is single-use, but it's a negligible amount. The EU Parliament in 2018, in their microplastic report, gives a more thorough overview of the sources of microplastics, though. They say primary microplastics, quote, are estimated to represent 15 to 31% of microplastics in the ocean, and secondary microplastics, quote, account for 69 to 81% of microplastics found in the oceans. So our focus is on secondary microplastics. These sources have absolutely destroyed our oceans and inundated them with incomprehensible amounts of microplastics, though. According to Erickson, Cowger et al., they place the estimate of microplastic contamination within the trillions. They say, quote, today's global abundance is estimated at approximately 82 to 358 trillion plastic particles weighing 1.1 to 4.9 million tons circulating in our oceans. So the question I think arises, why are microplastics bad? Well, a lot of reasons. There are big two ones: health impacts and exacerbating and accelerating climate impacts, which we'll get into a little bit later, and that's probably something you haven't heard of. So with respect to the health impacts, microplastics make their way into our food supply through animals that consume them, or by getting into our water supply, and so on. And the truth is that there's a strong suspicion in the scientific community that microplastics have harmful effects, but the hard data right now is kind of limited, mainly because it's a relatively new issue, and studies like these take years or even decades. But if you're looking for some straightforward cards, here's this from the Geneva Environment Network in 2024, saying, quote, scientific results to date to indicate plastic causes diseases, disability, and premature death at every stage of its life cycle. They also say scientifically proven health effects include causing cancer or changing hormone activity, known as endocrine disruption, which can lead to reproductive growth and cognitive impairment. Many of the toxic chemical additives have several other known health impacts, persist in the environment, and bioaccumulate in exposed organisms. We'll get into that in a minute. Research also revealed that microplastics can harm our health and act as vessels for pathogens, like we mentioned with the corals, to enter our system, increasing the spread of diseases. And additionally, you have this from the United Nations Environment Program in 2023, saying, quote, microplastics are associated with serious health impacts, especially in women, and these can include changes to human genetics, brain development, and respiration rates, among other health issues. I mean, it is a pretty damning thing, to be frank. It is very bad. Admittedly, the health impact is hard to quantify, and it's also hard to show that single-use plastics specifically are responsible for microplastic ingestion. So this is kind of a risky impact that strong con teams have good responses for. But for many judges, cards like these will be enough to persuade them that the risk of letting unknown chemicals into their bodies is absolutely terrible and would outweigh anything the con could possibly say. But if that's not enough for them, you also have the fact that microplastics are eroding Earth's natural defenses against climate change, basically shutting down its immune system to global warming.
This is the good stuff here, folks.
Right.
This is the one you want to understand.
Right. As for how this works, and it's pretty complex, so I'll let the card do the talking here, Claire Asher in October of 2023, an ecology journalist, explains this in comprehensible detail. Phytoplankton take up carbon to help fuel photosynthesis, and they integrate that carbon into their tissues. They are then eaten by zooplankton, whose feces sink to the ocean floor, carrying the carbon with it. When plankton die, they too sink it to the bottom, carrying the carbon they contain with them. This stored carbon is then released into deep ocean water through decomposition or buried in seafloor sediments. This process is literally the most important and relatively unnoticed biological backstop against reaching a carbon extinction threshold. So basically, phytoplankton absorb carbon, zooplankton eat them, and let's just call it what it is, poop them and their carbon out, and it sinks to the bottom of the ocean where it's stored. That's how the ocean captures carbon. It's a weird, graphically weird process, but that's how they do it. Okay, but now Asher explains why microplastics are disrupting that carbon capture system. And I'm not going to read this word for word, but she's basically telling us that microplastics make zooplankton feces float back up to the surface. I'm sorry, I can't keep a straight face. Rather than sinking to the bottom.
We're very mature here.
Right.
Debate.
Sinking to the bottom, which disrupts or prevents the carbon storage function from happening. And we'll just flash these quotes on the screen here. So basically, this is the perfect storm. Not only are plastics nudging on fossil fuel consumption and will pretty much single-handedly keep the petrochemical industry in business, but increasing consumption of SUPs or single-use plastics is slowly detooling the ocean's ability to store massive amounts of carbon. But what does the U.S. have to do with all this?
Well, I can tell you the U.S. action is essential. We need U.S. action because if we don't have it, there's going to be some big problems. So
well, that's a relief.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly. So congratulations,
yeah.
Pro. You have this. So the U.S. is an interesting position when it comes to banning single-use plastics. The United States is the largest producer of plastic waste and pollution, mainly stemming from our overconsumption of single-use plastics. Again, I'm not going to keep beating a dead horse. A majority of plastic waste is from single-use plastics. So by banning single-use plastics, the United States can strike at both internal and external plastic pollution and production on a massive and international scale. Quickly, let's address the elephant in the room. It's widely held that the United States has one of the most efficient plastic waste management systems in the world. And as we'll get into later, most estimates basically leave the United States out of global ocean plastic pollution rankings. However, this is misleading. Kara Lavender, Law, and many others, in 2020 study on U.S. plastic waste management found that U.S. contributions to oceanic pollution was actually far larger than initially estimated. They state that the United States generated the largest amount of plastic waste of any country in the world. 42 metric tons, or metric.
I think it's megatons.
Megatons, yeah, not metric tons. That would be pretty small. Yeah, so megatons. Further, the United States is the second largest exporter of plastic scrap globally. If imported material is not properly managed in the receiving country, environmental inputs of plastic waste generated in the United States may be much higher than previously assessed.
And that's actually really important because later on we're going to make the argument that the United States knows how to dispose of its plastic waste, so it's not really the problem. The con is going to say, we know how to dispose of this stuff. When we dispose of it, we don't produce very much waste per capita, and that's true. But what Tanner is telling you here is that we and other developed countries artificially drive that down because we export a lot of a significant amount of our plastic waste to other countries, and then they mishandle it, right? And so in the status quo, our numbers in terms of like efficiency of our waste disposal system are artificially inflated because we're sending some of the trash, right, to other less developed countries where it in turn makes its way into the ocean, right?
Right here, this graphic, it shows that trend, and we can see that that's And we can see the U.S. is ranked #1 in plastic waste generation, 42 megatons. So the United States would impact plastic usage and leakage on an international scale with a single-use plastic ban, reducing the globe's second largest supply of plastic scrap, which is inevitably prone to mismanagement, and massively reducing the supply of plastic waste.
Yeah, and more generally, I guess what I would say on this is I think the pro has to make a sort of don't make the perfect the enemy of the good argument. You might look to see if you can find some evidence that suggests that the United States acting on this would be likely to inspire other countries to follow suit. Usually there's somebody out there who says that about most reforms. If you can find evidence like that, it might not be a bad idea. But even if you can't, I think what you argue is that incremental reform is the only way that this can happen, right? What we have on the table before us, Judge, is a U.S. ban. I will agree with my opponents that it's important that we have something more broad than that, but that's not what this resolution puts on the table in front of us. So something is better than nothing. Starting the solution is better than doing nothing at all. So that is sort of basically it for the pro. I think it's a pretty straightforward and yet comprehensive set of arguments. So we will now move on to the other side of the coin, which is arguments on the con. All right, let's get started on the con. I think the con has a similar sort of diversity of arguments that we saw on the pro. I want to get started with what I think is a pretty practical argument. This was one that I wrote, but it's not original to me. It's out there in the literature, but I haven't seen it talked about as much with respect to like academic debate, like competitive debate, or this topic as much as I'd like. I don't know that it wins the round for you by itself, but it's something we need to keep in mind, and that is the idea that the U.S. is really not the problem, and consequently, it's also not the solution to the issue of like plastic waste and plastic pollution. I think that this is a really sort of important common sense, real talk point that con teams either need to put in the case or at least have it ready in blocks for rebuttals and to understand the argument so you can be conversant about it. And it's basically the idea that there are plenty of countries that have single-use plastics in abundance, but as Tanner alluded to earlier, aren't really contributing, at least at a per capita level, anywhere near the amount of plastic pollution as other countries. As it turns out, the U.S. is one of the lowest per capita contributors to plastic pollution in the world, despite the massive absolute numbers of single-use plastics it uses. Meanwhile, when you look to other less developed countries, they contribute orders of magnitude more plastic pollution per capita. So maybe this argument goes, if that's the case, the problem isn't that single-use plastics exist and therefore need to be banned. It's what we do with them. And by extension, if that's the case, maybe a ban is both, number one, overkill, at least in developed countries that don't produce that much per capita, and also, number two, unlikely to have much of an impact overall on global levels of plastic pollution if we've already got it at relatively low levels per capita. So let's dive into this argument. If you read nothing else on this point, just read a summary from Hannah Ritchie at Our World in Data in 2021, which summarizes other academic studies, most notably a study by Lorenz, Major, and others in 2021. So if you want to understand this argument, just go to this article from Hannah Ritchie. You don't even need to listen to what I say, but I'm going to explain some of it, right? So the Ritchie piece says 81% of ocean plastics are emitted from Asia. The fact that a disproportionate amount of plastic pollution comes from Asia is consistent with previous research. Earlier studies estimated its share was 86%. Africa was responsible for 8%, South America 5.5%, North America 4.5%, and Europe and Oceania combined were less than 1%. The Philippines accounts for more than 1/3 of plastic inputs, India for 13%, and China for 7%. As you can see here in this graphic, they show you that like 10 rivers in the world comprise a huge percentage, a majority of all the plastics that make their way into the ocean. And if you look at this graphic from the Our World in Data piece, you see they're in places like the Philippines and Malaysia and India and the Philippines and the Philippines and the Philippines and the Philippines. And I don't know what they're doing or not doing in the Philippines with their plastic waste, but it's obviously a major issue. Look at the next graphic we have here. This is the share of global plastic waste emitted into the ocean, as we talked about earlier. Over 80% from Asia, and down there you see North America at 4.5%, right? Now you could turn this around and make a pro argument out of it by saying, look at Europe. The EU has implemented essentially a ban on this stuff, and now Europe is a fraction of what North America is. So there's different ways to slice the statistics, right? But in fact, per capita, the United States and other developed countries contribute and create a relatively tiny proportion of plastic waste in the world's ocean. The Hannah Ritchie summary continues by saying that rich countries contribute very little plastic to the ocean. European countries, for example, 0.1 kilograms. Again, you can sort of see this in the chart that we had before. Now, this is true for the United States, so let's take a look with another graphic, and we can see in very literal terms how little the U.S. per capita share is, right? This is an interactive chart they had on that article, and we pulled up the United States, and as you can see here, if you look up at the top, some of the main offenders, these dots at the very top of the chart, and those include places like Malaysia and the Philippines, they're contributing over 3 kilograms per person per year in terms of plastic waste. Look at the United States. It is less than 0.01 kilograms per person per year, 1/100th of 1 kilogram. So you see these serious offenders, these middle income countries, right, like the Philippines, are contributing literally hundreds of times more per capita than the United States. And if you want a really great visual representation of all this, there's this from Louis Wicaksono, I think that's how you say it, I'm guessing, from Visual Capitalist. It has this sort of soccer ball graphic that they like to make at that site. And as you see, the Philippines looks like it's, almost a third. It's not quite a third, but it's right there. If you look at this graphic, you're not going to see the United States because we're lumped in with the, quote, rest of the world down there in the bottom right corner. So if that's true, right, it raises some really important questions, like how much good would a U.S. ban do given that most of the damage is being done by other countries? Now, to be fair, putting trash in the oceans is not the only problem. You can still get microplastics in groundwater when you put these things into a landfill. And landfills are the reason why our numbers are lower here. We're good at putting things in landfills. Presumably, the Philippines is not. So this doesn't answer everything for the con. You still have the possibility of microplastics, and certainly the manufacture is still a major problem. The fact that we're creating huge amounts of climate change gases and things like that from manufacture. But at least on the issue of oceanic pollution, this seems to be a major answer, which is that the problem isn't that these things exist. The problem is that some countries don't know what to do with it or aren't able because of their economic levels or their infrastructure to respond to it. Because the United States uses a lot of disposable plastic stuff. But countries like the Philippines, Suriname, Trinidad, and Tobago, they end up, as we said, putting hundreds of times more waste into the ocean. And look, I'm pretty sure that the good folks in Trinidad and Tobago aren't drinking 250 times as many big gulps from the 7-Eleven as people here in the United States. I'm pretty sure we've got them beat. So maybe the problem isn't that single-use plastics exist. Maybe the problem is that some countries lack the infrastructure to dispose of them in a proper manner. And if that's the case, then how much good would a U.S. ban even do? Maybe the solution isn't a flat ban on single-use plastics. Maybe it's a ban on throwing single-use plastics in the river. Or more realistically, maybe it's something like laws and policies to help improve waste disposal infrastructure and practices. But even that would not necessarily be something that would be implemented by the United States federal government because the countries that have the most serious problems with it aren't the United States. So that's something to think about, in terms of responses to issues of like how much trash makes its way into the ocean, which is that it's not that it exists, it's that some countries don't know how to dispose of it or aren't able to dispose of it properly.
Yeah, and to that point, while we don't know what the actual difference in benefit might be on a federal scale, we do know what the detriments might be, and that would be seen in
rising costs. So the reason every grocery store and restaurant that isn't banned from doing it has some kind of single-use plastic is because they're inexpensive. If there was something else that was cheaper, then plastic bags wouldn't be out there, or at least they wouldn't be as widespread. But because they're inexpensive, they're everywhere. And getting rid of plastics would, very intuitively, essentially raise the cost of doing business and consequently raise the cost to the consumer. So according to the website, This Is Plastics, and yes, that's an industry website, we know that, but it says proponents of plastic bag bans may mean well, but product bans and taxes can increase costs for consumers and businesses, creating taxes and fees that hurt business owners and shoppers who can least afford to pay them. The same source continues and gives a case study for Seattle's plastic bag ban. They say, Seattle's plastic bag ban is causing store owners to spend 40 to 200% more on alternative carry-out bags, directly affecting their bottom lines. A tax on plastic bags at grocery and retail stores hurts those people who are poor and already food insecure. So prices are going to go up as a result of not using single-use plastics. That's pretty intuitive. The reason they're used is that they're cheap. One of the benefits of single-use plastics is that, again, they don't drive up the cost to the customer. If you want to put this in very visceral terms, according to Cynthia R. Harris, Deputy Director of Center of State, Tribal, and Local Environmental Programs, it talks about how unhoused people, unsheltered people, basically what we call homeless people, often benefit greatly from single-use plastic. For example, transportable miniature toiletries. And in this piece, she talks about how access to adequate sanitation without these things is going to be a challenge for homeless individuals. So next, according to Dr. Andrew Jinks from the University of Delaware's Department of Political Science and International Relations in 2019, he talks about how alternatives to single-use plastics, like straws, for example, often disadvantage the disabled. And what it says is that recent proposals in U.S. cities to ban single-use plastic straws have been adopted quickly and with little resistance, yet there remains a critical mass of people who are systematically left out of the conversation. Disabled people. Those people are not only overlooked, but are othered for being poor or disabled or both. And so what he does in this piece, and we're going to pop this up on the screen as sort of a chart that comes with it, is point out that and just the example of single-use straws. That many of these have serious problems with them for disabled individuals that don't make them viable alternatives. It's easy for us as able-bodied people who don't have to think about these things or just want to do it voluntarily to not worry about them. But for example, when we talk about metal straws, well, you've got an injury risk, it's not positionable, it's costly, it's not high temperature safe, it's an allergy risk, and it's a sanitation risk. So in many instances, these single-use plastics, again, not just straws, but straws are the example here, provide potentially convenience for the disabled, and of course for people who are lower income, they slightly lower the grocery bill every time you go to the grocery store. And what this does is say that doing this is not costless, and many of the people who are going to bear the cost are frankly not the people in this room, Judge. Many of us as debaters come from relatively privileged backgrounds. Many of us are able-bodied. We're not the ones who are going to feel this in many cases, but other people who are less advantaged are.
Right, and I think that segues really well into having, there's exceptions to this rule. And this specific point right here that I'm going to make is that there are going to be useful single-use plastics. They're used all throughout the country, all throughout the world. But this might come as a surprise to you, but not all single-use plastics are your McDonald's cup or your Starbucks coffee. There are lots of other ones. So according to This Is Plastics, again, industry site, but it's applicable, they discuss the many ways in which single-use plastics are used. They state that instruments such as syringes, applicators, drug tests, bandages, and wraps are often made to be disposable. Furthermore, single-use plastic products have been enlisted in the fight against food waste, keeping food and water fresher for longer, and reducing the potential for contamination. Again, the same trend is seen from Courtney Lindwall at the Natural Resource Defense Council in 2020. She states that there are many uses for plastics that are not only reasonable, but important, such as surgical gloves or straws for people with disabilities, which Brett just talked about. Dr. Paul Harvey at McGuire University in 2018, he states that there are some single-use plastics we truly need, and the rest we can live without. But he is talking about specific exceptions to this full ban. He states that take medication, for example, where single-use plastics are a key part of infection control. Having a blood test requires gloves made from plastics, a plastic syringe, and a plastic vial. It goes on and on about how we use single-use plastics for reasons that will help us medically or help us with food contamination or contamination in general. So you can read the blurb on the screen, but it's really useful. So useful instruments that are used to save food from spoiling, keep water fresher for longer, and instruments used in healthcare that help those to get better would be banned under a full ban of single-use plastics.
And I would point out, just to be very precise about what we're saying here, number one, I think you can give numerous examples of specific medical items, gloves, syringes, pipettes, things along those lines that need to be disposable. I think we can all safely say that we're a lot more comfortable knowing that the syringe that's used to draw our blood has never been used on anybody else and will never be used again. But in addition to that, I don't want to gloss over this, this is in the Paul Harvey quote, very frequently single-use plastics are used to deliver supplies of food and water into like disaster areas. Hurricanes, earthquakes, things along those lines. Single-use containers of plastic, jugs of water, containers of water, containers of food are necessary to distribute these things effectively at a relatively low cost and very quickly. So he's talking about how these things are extremely useful in that regard. So again, as we're going to talk about in just a second, we can say that the bulk of single-use plastics may be bad, but we can also point out a lot of very significant exceptions where I think we could all agree that the benefits outweigh the harms.
Right, yeah. Healthcare, research purposes, emergency situations, these are all useful areas where we need single-use plastic. So under a full ban, all of the benefits that Dr. Harvey talks about and a lot of the other sources that I just said would be gone. All of those benefits are gone, and we have to find another way to curb around them. And that's going to be very difficult, and there isn't an alternative yet. So many people may say that these products can be replaced with some other material, but Time magazine says otherwise. Again, they talk about the feasibility of replacing these single-use plastics, and I'll put the blurb on the screen, but we really can't. It says before we do a full switch over, we really need to focus on addressing a number of different challenges, including customer education, waste recovery infrastructure, and the economic incentives to a full transition. This little quote here is a great example of saying we can't rush into the situation. There are so many other things we need to consider rather than just putting a full-on ban and making the person that needs it for medical treatment or need it for emergency situations like an earthquake and they need water to their specific area.
Right.
There's so many other areas we need to consider rather than just saying, all right, everybody needs to switch to metal straws. That's just not the right situation. That's what Time is talking about.
And this is what the EU, by the way, did by having its multi-tiered approach. They looked at things that had effective substitutes where it would be cost effective, where you could easily use something other, a disposable item other than plastic. And they said, okay, for those we can ban them. But then after their very extensive review, they said, but for other things, we're not at a point yet where we have the ability to replace them. And for some things, like syringes, like sterile gloves, we may never be. And I think that multi-tiered approach, that case-by-case approach, is probably the best one.
Right, and this brings us to our fifth and final point. Woohoo! Anything but a ban, right?
Right.
And this, you just get up here as a this is a really small, basically just theoretical point where you say, let's just come back to our senses. At the outset of this video, we briefly alluded to a modest plan that basically got rid of all of the bad products and sensibly allowed for us to keep the necessary single-use plastics that literally save lives and support disabled populations.
The European Union directive.
Right. We don't have to pull this draconian Footloose-esque ban on all single-use plastics where we say no big gulp cup.
Are you going to explain what Footloose-esque means? Okay, it's this old movie where they banned all dancing in a town. Okay, it was a movie about banning all dancing in a town.
Kevin Bacon was in it.
Kevin Bacon was in it. It's a bad idea to ban all dancing. You seriously think that a bunch of 16-year-olds?
You never know. I knew what it was.
What is wrong with you?
I'm not that much older.
Okay, anyway, continue.
Right. The point is that you don't just have to wave your finger and say, we're going to ban literally every single-use plastic out there. You can do what they did. And you can look at what is ending up in our rivers, oceans, lakes, bloodstreams even, and decide to ban those. If it's not dangerous or pollutive, why ban it?
Okay, so, and on this point, I want to talk for just a second, just kind of extemporaneously here. Number one, this deals with something we've talked about before on this channel, which is a question of like counterplans in public forum. So if you say, like, here's what I would suggest if I knew I could get away with it in a public forum round. I would get up and say, I don't necessarily disagree with the pro that there are a lot of things that probably shouldn't be out there. What I disagree with is the idea of a flat across-the-board ban. And what I think we should be doing in lieu of that is essentially what the European Union did with its directive, which is a case-by-case review of the costs and benefits of each individual single-use plastic. So like polystyrene containers that can be easily replaced, they're bad, kick them out. Sterile gloves and plastic syringes that help us keep sanitation, and maybe some emergency like transportation vectors for water and things like that, they're good, keep them in, and maybe also implement some education, and harm reduction strategies to go along with it. But the bottom line is, what we're telling you, Judge, on the con is reject a flat, broad brush ban, don't use a jackhammer, use a scalpel, go case by case and evaluate the value of each individual product. Now, I know what a lot of people are going to say, because I've seen this argument play out when I'm judging PF rounds, is like, that sounds like a counterplan. And you've heard us on this channel talk about, I don't think that's the case. I think that the PF rules clearly say no plans or counterplans, but they say common sense solutions. And I think in this case, you can literally point to the single biggest example in the world, which is the EU directive, and say this is exactly what they've done. I'm not going to give you a specific plan that goes point by point by point and says ban this, don't ban that. I'm saying a better approach would be to just broadly speaking, look case by case and do a cost-benefit analysis for each one rather than a flat across-the-board ban, Judge. I think if you can make that theoretical argument and win it, then basically you can, I don't mean to be too, sort of colorful here, but you can kind of nuke a lot of the pros impacts from orbit by saying, we'll do everything that you would do that's good. We just don't want to get rid of syringes. We don't want to get rid of sterile gloves, and a handful of other things. We want to go case by case. Did I understand that correctly?
Right.
Yeah, and I just want to add one point on that, and we've talked about this, like Brett said, a couple of other times. On the point of plans and counterplans, saying that we should just go to a reform plan or like a modest plan only that just gets rid of a couple of the bad things that pollute the rivers, oceans, and lakes and keep the things that are necessary, that is literally no more comprehensive than the pros plan, which is to ban everything. It is just the exact same thing where you're alluding to something that should happen and then going over the impacts.
Again, the rule says no plans or counterplans. So if ban everything is not a plan, and presumably it's not, or the pro literally couldn't win, then go case by case is not a counterplan. They are both common sense proposals, I think. That's my view. That's what I would argue.
Right, and I also think too, there's so much evidence out there to show that there are some bans, like one in San Jose, there's one in, I guess, San Francisco worked, like you can use these kind of exception plans and say, you know what, there was a reduction. You can see that there are impacts here. So if you want to throw it at the wall and say, hey, look, Judge, it actually does work. A full ban, not even the European Union did it, and they were successful, which the pro will probably use as one of their case studies of a full ban, but they can't use that because it's not a full ban. So, yeah.
So anyway, this comes back to the point that I was trying to make at the very beginning of the video and the initial thoughts, which is the idea that I think the pro has, for me, the stronger hand in terms of the evidence and the sort of standard debate arguments, but the con has some strategic positions, and if they win them, they actually take the high ground, so to speak, and are in a better position. So with that is what we've got on the con. We will come back in just 1 second with some final thoughts. Okay, so we've come down to the end of it. Very quickly on this topic, what are your final thoughts, Tanner?
Yeah, so I got 3 very simple things for you. First is be practical. Second is use imagery. And third is simplify large numbers. So be practical with this topic. I mean, there can be a lot of perspectives on it. It's pretty cut and dry, like it really is, but be practical with it because they might throw out some numbers or some study. Just be very simple with it. Talk to the judge. Tell them the story. There's a large problem with single-use plastics, or if a ban isn't effective, just be practical. Use imagery like the big garbage trucks. That's something that pretty much everybody can understand.
The continent of Africa.
Yeah, the continent of Africa, like it's huge, right? So like use that imagery so it can like transcend and kind of imprint on the judge's brain to be like, you know what, that's kind of a big deal.
Yep.
And then lastly, simplify large numbers. Like we're talking about megatons and gigatons and what is that, So like, we're not gonna say, just simplify it, Again, go back and lean back on that imagery. Just don't give them a large number and hope that they'll buy it. Like give them something to kind of hang their hat on and be like, yeah, I get it. Like I get how that's a big deal. We need to do something about it.
All right, sounds good. Devin, what do you got?
I don't have a lot to say. I don't think that we have to be really verbose in our opinions on this because I don't think there are a lot of laid traps out there for you on either the pro or the con. Like Tanner said, this is extremely cut and dry. And you just get up there and be rhetorical, explain these things. With the plankton poop thing, it's extremely impactful. You're gonna have to be a bit more mature about it.
Than we were.
Right, and you're gonna have to actually explain it and make the judge understand. But after that, there's no weird, definition battle. There's no weird framing battle. It's going to be back and forth and impacting it out, and that's what debaters do. So I don't think that you guys are going to have a whole lot of trouble with this, and you'll probably have a lot more fun with it.
Yeah, and that actually is my point, which is I think this is a topic you can kind of have fun with. I know that watching these PF rounds, it becomes mini policy, and so many of y'all, very good debaters, I know why you do it, but you really get sort of religiously adherent to a lot of these cards and reading these statistics and just pounding on them. But this is something where, in addition to the evidence, you can actually talk in practical terms. You can explain, for example, to a judge that the impact of losing or replacing a styrofoam cup with a perhaps slightly less sturdy paper cup is just not going to change their life. It's not going to make it materially worse. There's just not a lot of downside to reusing your sort of plastic tumbler and filling it up when you go to a restaurant as opposed to repeatedly using these single-use plastic. So I think there is some room, as both of you suggested, to have a little fun, talk in visceral terms about dump trucks of trash in the ocean and the emissions of the entire continent of Africa and things along those lines, and then also, sort of work in the evidence as well. And judges appreciate that. Like, we really get tired after our 4th or 5th round of just hearing nothing but statistics and crazy links and people just talking past each other. And if you're able to sort of talk in practical terms, our ears perk up, we listen to you, and we're more likely to vote for you. So So with that, another month is in the books. Appreciate these guys. Appreciate you. And we'll see you back here next month in March for another topic. Who knows what it'll be. And until then, just remember, debate is for everybody. So work hard, have fun, and hail state.